Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much. And as I always say, all the better for being able to share with you a lovely story, because personally, nothing is richer and more wonderful in life than a good story. It really makes life so much more worthwhile. So before we get started, don't forget to get that quintessential drink, and whatever it is, make sure you let me know if it's something very unusual and exciting, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. So let's get started. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was a spring day in 1962 when our family moved into a rather picturesque log cabin on a sizable cotton farm where my dad was hired as farm manager by the landowner there, Mr. Lawrence Fairweather, in the North Carolina countryside. Our whimsical, enchanting cottage was given to us as one of the perks of the job, as my father was replacing the old farm manager, who had become rather hard of hearing and had developed chronic arthritis, so he had taken early retirement with his family and promptly moved to a nearby local town. My dad was fortunate to get the job out of several dozen applicants, and the landowner had promptly chosen him because of his great sense of humour, his nimble agility and physical fitness. As he said, he couldn't abide people with hangdog faces who always looked miserable working on his farm. "Cotton has come a long way," he told my father, while lighting up his pipe and blowing out a stream of pungent smoke. "We have overcome many of the hurdles with the crops in recent years. Better irrigation systems and fertilizers, along with seeds that resist the dreaded boll weevil. It used to cause so much devastation for many of my predecessors before me. However, cotton farming still requires hard-working people, with grit, character, and a positive attitude. And over the years I've employed some less than desirable, rather surly-looking characters that I'd sooner rather not remember. I need someone in charge of the work team with a sense of humour and a good mental attitude that demands respect. And so, yes, I think you'll do very nicely indeed." The wooden cabin was situated at the far end of the farm, close to a large railway track that ran through the countryside. On the left-hand side of our cabin was a very sizable wood green that went back for many miles and was full of lovely mature statuesque red maples, oaks and tulip trees. Sometimes the trains that went by our home were carrying cargo like coal, and other times passengers. I was about 10 years old when we moved into our charming cottage that was made from 100-year-old timber beams and had so much character. I remember how excited we were to live in such an idyllic part of the world that was so picturesque and tranquil, apart from when the trains went by, because they could cause the windows of the cabin to rattle and shake. The sound of a high-pitched strident horn or shrill whistle blowing could be heard for miles around, and it could make quite an ear-piercing raucous commotion. After a while our family got used to the chew, chug or chuff or chugging sounds, if you like, of the train at night, and I began to rather enjoy hearing it going by. It was like a reassuring, soothing, comforting sound to me that still brings nostalgic memories of my youth back to me today. As children, we loved watching the trains going by, especially when they contained passengers, and my two younger sisters and I would sit on the top of the verdant, hilly embankment several feet away from the approaching train, and we would wave at the seated passengers with our handkerchiefs, and the occupants would often wave back at us, sometimes looking at us over the paper or a book that they were reading, with big amused smiles on their faces. I was the older brother, and so I considered it my responsibility to take care of my younger female siblings, but that did not mean that I didn't encourage them to do stupid things like playing on the tracks only moments before a train was coming our way, as we so enjoyed playing some of those dicey, risky games that if my mother had known about them would have seriously given her pause for thought, and she would have been none too pleased with us. As kids, we didn't care about doing dangerous things, because we always believed somehow we were invincible. Looking back, the most terrifying game we ever played was lying back on the tracks moments before the train came by, which we thought was hysterically funny. We didn't realise how foolish we were being. I would sometimes hear the driver cursing us. "Those bloody children again!" He would wave his fists at us indignantly and shout out, "You could have been killed! Don't play on the rails, you kids! Next time I might mow you down!" One day I got the brilliant novel idea to paint large signs on hefty pieces of cardboard with bright colourful capital letters to lift up to all the passengers to read, like "Have a great day." And they appeared to love those signs and were very responsive to them. Every day we would make a completely different sign with a brand new message, and everyone would look up from their newspapers to read our messages, and they would wave and blow kisses at us. There was an old man in the passenger train that wore spectacles and a bright red scarf, who was always highly amused by us, and he would lift up a large piece of cardboard with the words painted in blue that said, "You kids have a great day too." We were thrilled to get that message from him. For some reason, because of the curve in the railway track, some of the trains slowed down on that turning, as in the past it had presented a few challenges. One time a couple of trains had been derailed on that part of the track, and on one occasion a ton of coal had fallen off one of the carts by accident, and we had collected it all for the winter months, and had enjoyed the benefits of free coal. As a safety precaution, the trains tended to slow down there, which was great for us as kids, because we got a better view of the passengers. Sometimes we would watch trains carrying freight, or even open carriages piled high with heaps of black coal. But for us, those trains were far less exciting. On one glorious summer's day, that all changed, however, for us, quite significantly, and the trains carrying coal became the ones that held the most interest and appeal. For it would seem that this train would on occasion be carrying a very unusual passenger, of the likes that none of us had ever seen before. And for us this strange, incongruous, outlandish being was infinitely more exciting than the President of the United States, or the Queen of England herself, if they were to get off the train, that is. "What's that?" said my sister Julia, who was about 9 years old at the time, and was pointing towards a pile of coal on the 6th carriage as the train began to approach us. We could see something black, tall and wide, rising from the heap of coal, rather like a dark, solid, ghostly shadow, which really was quite discomposing. We watched it jumping off the carriage, landing on his feet, on the ground, with the agility of a domestic cat, and then gliding steadily up the hilly embankment, only yards away from where we were sitting. On seeing us, he stood very still and stopped for a moment, regarding us through his deep-set dark eyes that looked really rather kind, but with an expression of bewilderment on his dark, leathery, human-like face, as if to say, "What are you doing here?" when we were all thinking exactly the same thing. What on earth was this strange, idiosyncratic being, I wondered privately to myself, for never in all my born days had I ever seen such an eccentric, quirky-looking creature like this before, and I couldn't fathom what it was. It looked human, but it certainly wasn't fully human, and it was large and stocky like a bear, but this was no bear, for it stood up like a man, very straight, towering at about 8 foot tall, with a very sizable large-barreled chest, and strapping shoulders, overlong arms that hung below the knees, and powerful short stocky legs. I also discerned that the head was like that of a pyramid shape that you often see in the ape species, and I did not discern a neck at all, but the face was so incredibly human it was almost uncanny. The hair on this creature was blacker than the blackest black, and was so black it was almost blue, and it was 4 inches long and shaggy. The fantastical creature stared at us for a moment, and his treacle-brown eyes were curious, kind and congenial. We didn't detect any signs of animosity or aggression from him. Should we have been scared? Most certainly. On reflection, I think our fear was completely bypassed and suppressed by shock and astonishment, so much so that we didn't even know how to react, as what we were seeing with our eyes was so incongruent, paradoxical, and out of alignment with our reality. Even after the creature had glided away and disappeared into the heart of the woods, my sister Julia looked at me and said, "Hank, did we actually see that?" I nodded. We really did see that, I assured her. My 6-year-old sister Natalia jumped up and down with excitement. We saw a coal man, she said. We saw a coal man. Over dinner that evening, Julia and I were bursting to tell our parents what we had seen earlier on in the day. My mother was plating up beef stew when I piped excitedly. You'll never believe what we saw today, Mum. What did you see, Hank? Asked my mother, smiling at my bodacious enthusiasm, while she continued to plate me up a large portion of stew. We saw a giant ape-like man, said Julia, eagerly interrupting me. He was covered in hair. Oh, said my mother, well, maybe he was a man wearing a fur coat. We don't get apes in America, sweetheart. You must have been mistaken about what you saw. I could see that my mother was humouring us, and it absolutely infuriated me. Why did she not take anything we ever said seriously? Why were adults so cynical of kids and so dismissive about anything we told them? We're not making it up, Mummy, I said. We saw a big human creature covered in thick hair that was blacker than black. He took a lift on the coal cart, and we saw him jump off the cart on the train and venture into the woods. Well, no wonder he was black, laughed my mother. If he'd been sitting in the coal, he would most certainly give you the impression of being black as coal. He was probably a vagrant taking a little lift. No, I tried to explain. You don't understand, Mother. We saw the coal man, Mummy, a big coal man, and he was covered in long hair, cried my sister Natalia, looking very thrilled with herself. That's nice, dear, said my mother, looking incredibly disinterested and, of course, very unimpressed at the same time. Why bother telling adults anything, I thought. They never took anything we said seriously. Don't get too close to those trains, kids, said my father, addressing me, diving into his stew. This is delicious, sweetheart, he said to my mother, and before long the conversation shifted to what my father's day had been like on the cotton plantation. From that moment on, my sister and I firmly decided to never ever discuss with our parents what we'd seen. But we regularly went to watch the train with the rail carts, bountifully filled with coal going by, and sometimes we would see the black hairy humanoid jumping off the rail car and gliding up the rocky embankment towards where we were sitting. I think taking the train was like a huge game to him, as there were indeed times we would watch him counterbalance his hefty body on the edge of the coal cart, like balancing on a tightrope. Of course he could have been showing off, but I don't actually think that was the case. We realised that his rides on the train were a source of great entertainment for him, much like we would ride a roller coaster. I promise you I've never seen a creature with such extraordinary balance, nimbleness and stability, as he had the prowess of a masterful acrobat, and he walked on the edges of the coal cart, much like a tightrope, with such a stable footing, never once slipping. If I ever attempted half of what he did on that coal cart, I could potentially have lost a limb or been killed on the spot, as his antics would have been too dangerous to replicate. After a while we became used to seeing him, and he became used to seeing us, and we would often just sit there waiting for him. Upon seeing us he would stand for a moment and regard us rather bashfully with his friendly expressive eyes, but he seemed so overcome by a timid reserve and painful shyness that he was desperately trying to conquer. I think he was timid, diffident and reticent by nature, but he so wanted to have confidence and courage to change that, but somehow he couldn't, as it was in his natural genetic makeup to be evasive and self-effacing. It was really sad, because he had such a youthful, playful energy about him, which was stifled by his irresolute demeanour. We would watch the timorous creature gliding into the woods, sometimes glancing briefly at us over his sizable shoulders for a second, and we sensed he longed to make friends with us, as we did with him, but we doubted that that would ever happen. My sisters and I reached the conclusion he would use the train as an easy mode of transportation, because on the other side of the track there were also trains going in the opposite direction. I guess the hairy creature could jump on and off different rail carts at will, and with his black hair he would lie down on the coal and remain completely inconspicuous and invisible. One day my little sister Natalia ran up boldly to the creature. I could hardly believe it. She was wearing her tiny dress with white stockings and looked so terribly cute that it would have been difficult for your heart not to melt like butter upon seeing her. She dug into her pockets and handed the critter 2 apples. "For you," she said proudly. In that moment I could see a notable, very dramatic and miraculous change in the creature, almost as if we had managed to break through that hardened barrier of reserve. I could see the creature's face soften, and even the edges of his lips seemed to move upwards, and there was such a delighted, touched look in his eyes, as if in some way my sister's generosity had melted his heart like Swiss chocolate. He took the apples from her and patted her little back affectionately, as if to say thank you. My little sister looked so thrilled and boasted to us tirelessly that the coal man liked her the very best. Every time we saw the creature, my little sister Natalia had stuffed her pockets full with stuff she had saved especially for him. Sometimes, even at tea time, she would put away treats to give to the creature, like pecan nut pie or apple crumb cake. One day the creature squatted on the ground very low, patted his shoulders and indicated for Natalia to climb onto his back, so he could give her a ride. And she unhesitantly mounted his shoulders, and we watched her disappear into the woods, and we could hear her delighted giggles. The creature came gliding back, moments later, to deliver my sister back to us, and then he offered a lift to Julia, who eagerly accepted a ride from him. But when he came back and offered me a ride, I simply refused. I remember I was very indignant with both of my sisters for accepting rides on the strange creature's back, but they didn't care about my affronted protests, as they were having a whale of a time together. "You're just jealous," piped Julia, "just because you want a ride from the creature, but you just won't accept one because you're way too proud. But Natalia and I are having fun, and you can't stop us." "I'll tell Mum and Dad," I challenged her. "They won't believe you," she laughed. In truth, I was jealous of my sisters, as I secretly did want a ride on the creature's back, but I didn't want to admit it either. One day the creature observed my downcast expression and encouraged me to ride him by patting his shoulders several times. "Go on," said my sister Julia. "You know you want to. He also wants to give you a ride. Let him. He likes you." I didn't need much prompting or encouraging, although I was rather bashful and reticent as I climbed onto the creature's shoulders. He seemed to understand my shyness, and he glided with me through the wood green. I could see that to him I was as light as a feather, and the ride on his shoulders was much smoother than that of a horse. His movements were so effortlessly fluid, with a seamless agility, speed and grace, much like a cheetah, and whilst tackling mountainous inclines, he did so with the efficiency of a mountain goat, never slipping or losing his balance even once. Much like my sisters, I became hooked on those shoulder rides, which were easily 7 foot off the ground. It was one hell of an experience, of which I shall never ever forget. One day there was a knock at the cottage door, and my mother invited the gentleman in, if you can call him that. I recognised him as one of the workers that worked under my father's supervision, whom my father described as a miserable, cantankerous fellow that nobody liked at all. I had met him before when we'd been picking huckleberries, and he had screamed at us and told us to get lost. "Can I come in?" he asked my mother. "Of course you can, Winston," she said. "What is this about? Should you not be talking to my husband if it concerns your job?" "It's you I need to talk to, ma'am, and it concerns the conduct of your children that is very troubling to me." On hearing that, I put my ear to the door to ensure I did not miss out on the conversation. What on earth was Winston complaining about now, I wondered. "Oh dear," said my mother, "are they misbehaving? What have they done?" "I don't know how to put this to you," said the man. "It would seem your children are playing games with the wild man of the woods. I saw your little girl riding on his shoulders. I am concerned about her welfare, for this wild man could potentially be very dangerous." To this day I do not think my mother realised that my father's workman was talking about a big creature covered in hair, as I think she got her wires crossed and believed that an adult man with nefarious motives was playing games with her children, and that was very concerning for her. "Thank you for alerting me to this issue, Winston. I'm most obliged." After that incident, my mother constantly lectured us tirelessly about the dangers of strangers, Don't accept piggybacks from strange men, she told us, and don't ever talk to anyone you don't know, and never accept sweets from strangers. After that incident, we were less inclined to accept piggybanks from the creature for fear of being seen by Winston, but we always brought him food gifts, and he became a good friend to us. The creature never spoke to us in words, but more in facial expressions and a series of grunts, and he would draw in the sand to try and explain things to us. For what we could discern, he had a brother and a mother, but his father appeared to be dead, as he'd been killed by a hunter, which was desperately sad. They lived in the cave in the mountains and enjoyed riding the coal carts for fun. One day, as we were watching the passenger train and waving at all the people, a huge present was flung in our direction, landing on the flat verge in the bottom of the embankment, and we ran towards it eagerly and grabbed it, tearing it open with gleeful faces. There was a little note attached to the present which read, "To the 3 children on the railway line. I'm the old man sitting in the 3rd carriage, wearing the glasses and the bright red scarf. Seeing you children in the morning with your cheerful signs makes an old man incredibly happy. It also brings a smile to my face. I have told my wife about you all, and enclosed in this parcel are 3 knitted jerseys for the 3 of you that I hope are the right sizes. My wife is very good with her hands. Much love, James Reedman." I do remember that the sweaters were not only perfect, but the most magnificent sweaters that we've ever owned. And when we showed my mother our presents, she began to shed a couple of tears. "How terribly sweet," she said. "What a generous thing to do, making such fabulous sweaters for you. You really must have made the poor man so happy." The next day, as the train went past, we lifted up a sign which read, "Dear James, thanks for the sweaters," and we could see him lifting up his handkerchief and waving at us. After a couple of years of working at the cotton farm, my father ended up getting beaten up by the obnoxious, insolent Winston after he'd been drinking on the job and became belligerent and aggressive. I remember he beat my father so hard that my father's face was all cut up and his eyes had turned black from bruising. From day one, he'd always been giving my father a hard time and trying all kinds of duplicitous tricks in his sneaky attempts to get my father fired. He was bitterly resentful that he hadn't received the job as farm manager, as he had worked on the farm for 20 years and been very loyal to Mr. Fairweather. "I should be the manager," he had piped. "I've been here 20 years. I'm much more qualified for the job than you are." My father approached Mr. Fairweather to complain about what was going on at work and about Winston's conduct and how he was challenging him and had actually beaten him up on the job. "If you can't manage the team and keep the men under control, then maybe you should not be farm manager," Mr. Fairweather had said, whilst blowing the smoke from his pipe. At that, my father promptly tendered his resignation, which meant we were moving away, as my father did not want to remain working in a toxic environment, where he was not receiving respect from the workers. Luckily, my father did get an excellent replacement job on another farm, but we were very sad and aggrieved to leave the beautiful wooden cabin behind us, and, of course, the railway that we had grown to love so much, including, of course, the big creature, which we now know was Bigfoot. So we never saw old Mr. Redwood again, nor our hairy friend, that all these years later, we know who he is, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or Yeti. So there you are. That's my story. Well, that was the most fabulous story. Thank you so much for sharing that. I've always found railways and trains rather magical. I just want to apologise for any background sounds, especially my little min-pin snoring. I don't know what it is, but every time I do a taping, he tends to start snoring. I think he wants to be heard. But I apologise for any background sounds, birds and traffic. There's nothing I can really do about it. But love to each and every one of you. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Until next time, goodbye and good night.